The question of the identity of the people of God or the chosen people of God is a hot topic at the moment. A lot of people have been asking me to give some input in the comment section about who are the real people of God. Were they black people? We spoke in the last video about the Lemba tribe. These people are black and they trace their ancestry back to the people of God in Israel. And so does this suggest that the people who are there who are not necessarily black are maybe not the real people of God? And so this is a hot topic, and we try to share a little bit about that in our previous video with our friend Vocab Malone from the States, who is a specialist in this particular subject. And I want to encourage you to watch and follow his videos because he really goes a bit deeper into this subject. But in this video, we're going to be reacting to a video from Bishop Maponga, who's somebody who does sort of take some of the theology from this group, and you'll find in his books that he writes, The Gospel According to Maponga, that there are elements of Black Hebrew Israelite theology inside of it. And so Bishop Maponga is not somebody who's writing about African spirituality and the dark side of African spirituality and trying to bring us into confidence of why we should follow African spirituality. But he's always writing about the Bible and writing about black people in the Bible, which is not necessarily a wrong thing. I mean, if there are black people in the Bible, we should know about them. And we've highlighted the black people in the Bible, the Ethiopian eunuch, the Queen of Sheba, the Egyptian people. I don't want to really get into the fact that whether they were black or white, but from some of the research I've done in Egypt, I will be unpacking my thoughts as to what I think this group was like. But we have highlighted in this channel instances where the Bible talks about Africans and black people and so on. But Bishop Maponga feels like we as Christians don't do that enough. So we're going to be hearing his take on it and then giving some perspective after he shares his views. So let's get into it.
Chapter 19, chapter 18, chapter 20, 21, and 22 of the book of Isaiah talk about the slavery of the black people, being shipped to lands afar, and their women being stripped and men walking with bare buttocks. Is there. Then you read.
So I just want to clarify for some people who might not know what he's talking about. So in Isaiah chapter 20, you'll see that Isaiah is instructed by God to walk around and preach, naked and without any shoes on. And this is a symbolism that God is going to bring judgment to the people of Egypt, to the people of Nubia, can also be interpreted as Ethiopia. And so the Assyrians are going to come and they're going to bring judgment on the people of Egypt. And so this is what this prophecy is basically saying, that God is going to bring judgment on these people. And he is right. I mean, when we talk about Egyptians, Nubians, Ethiopians, we are talking about Africans. And I think more specifically, the word Ethiopia does mean those who are, well, the Greeks say it in a very negative way, that it's those with burnt faces. But we like to see it more as sun-kissed. We are sun-kissed. We wouldn't necessarily use it in a negative sense like that. So he is right that this is referring to Africans and, black people if we talk about Ethiopia and Nubia and so on.
Read all of it, including Deuteronomy chapter 28. By the time you're finishing chapter 20, 21 of Isaiah.
Sorry, and then I just want to highlight that Deuteronomy chapter 28 has nothing to do with Africans. Now, you're talking about people who were enslaved in Egypt, and then they are liberated from Africans, because Egypt is Africa and they were the ones who enslaved the people of God or the Jews. Now it's talking about the fact that if they continue to obey the Lord would bring blessings on them. But if they are disobedient to the Lord will bring curses. And one of these curses that will come upon them is that God will allow them to be taken to captivity. He will allow them to be shipped back to Egypt. If they disobey God. So this is more or less God saying that you have a choice. If you do good, God's going to bless you. If you do evil, God is going to reward you in the same way by allowing you to fall or for evil to come upon you.
Then there is a good news. Therefore the redeemed of the Lord shall return. They shall come back. I'll take you away to a far land, but I'll bring you back to this land again, etc. There's no other nation that was moved in ships and boats.
Where,
including the Jews
people, where were they moved from? And
from Africa
to
into America, into the Caribbean, into Britain. And then the same Bible actually goes on to say.
So I just want to highlight the part where he talks about no other nation has ever been shipped in boats. I mean, that is completely false. Today in South Africa, we have Indian people living here in South Africa because they were shipped from India to South Africa, enslaved in South Africa, forced to work in, in the sugar plantations and so on. They were enslaved the same way that we Africans were enslaved. And so we can't necessarily say we're the only people who were enslaved. I mean, even the Irish people were shipped to the Caribbean and so on, and they were also enslaved. And their slavery wasn't as severe as that of the black people. It's the same as the Indians. It wasn't as bad as the transatlantic slave trade, the treatment. But if you're saying we're the only people who were shipped in boats, that is completely false. The Irish were shipped. And in fact, this is not the only form of, I mean, the transatlantic slave trade is not the only slave trade that's ever happened. I mean, there's what we call the Barbary slave trade that was done by North Africans, and they would send ships to Europe, and they would just go into random towns and they would kidnap people and they would ship them back to Africa. So Africans also would go to other parts of the world and enslave people and ship them back to Africa. So it's completely false to say that we're the only people who were shipped. So, but let's carry on and just hear the rest of it.
But I will bring you back to your land. Beautiful prophecies. But because of the Eurocentric Christianity, that does not see a black man in the text. These prophecies are never spoken about. We are told that Jesus is coming again. How can Jesus come back again before repatriation and reparation if these promises will not be fulfilled? Then the Bible is a lie.
So is the gospel according to Maponga touching on those issues?
That I think what I've just shared with you right now is chapter 3, chapter 4. Yes. Who are the chosen nation?
So if we come to the prophecies in Isaiah, those prophecies have already been fulfilled because the Assyrians already actually went into Egypt and, they captured them, they enslaved them. And in fact, if you just read the history of the Assyrians, they always had this way of being very brutal in war, where they would actually hold or take the people into captivity. They'll take them to different parts of the world, disperse them, and then they'll take people, from other parts of the world, and they'll come and mix them with the people, of that place that they are conquering. They did that, in Israel as well. That's why we have the Sumerians. Samaria is basically a place of people who are mixed race. It was people who were mixed with Jews. They came from all different parts of the world when the Assyrians conquered Israel. So that judgment already happened. That prophecy already is fulfilled. But now there's also the prophecy in Deuteronomy chapter 28, which has also been fulfilled. Firstly, the children of Israel were taken as captives to Babylon. That's the first part where God said, if you disobey me, if you turn away from the law, you disobey my commandments, I will allow you to go to captivity. They went to Babylon to captivity. But also historically, we know from the historian Josephus, he writes about the Jewish wars where the Jews rebelled against the Romans. 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple. They captured some of the Jews in order to crush the rebellion. They actually shipped some of them to Egypt. And they did this in order that the Jews would not regroup and then begin another rebellion. In fact, a very interesting fact is that that's when the Romans actually named the place Palestine, because Palestine is a Latin word for Philistine. And so they were basically, trying to say this land belongs to your old rivals, the Philistines. And so we're going to rename it. So that's actually where the word, Palestine comes from. It's a colonial name, if you will. But historically, we know that this prophecy has also been fulfilled. But the people who were taken from Africa to America, and Bishop Maponga says, if this prophecy is not fulfilled, then the Bible is a lie. I think for the people to be returned back to Africa is the only way that this prophecy can be fulfilled, because he's saying the prophecy says, I will bring you back to the land. So the people in America, the Black Americans or African Americans, need to return back to Africa in order for that prophecy to be fulfilled the way that he is saying it. But we know, I have a lot of African American friends, and I always say to them, come move back to Africa, it'll be awesome. A lot of them don't want to return. And so to say that for this prophecy to be fulfilled, we need repatriation and all those things. I think it's important, for the things that have been done wrong in the past to actually be corrected. But however, to try and always look for a justification for it in the Bible. If somebody, for an example, steals from you, to tell them, bring that thing back. You don't need to find a scripture in the Bible to justify that. We can just easily say, what has been done wrong must be made right. But I think this is important because a lot of us like to interpret the Bible the way that we are. I mentioned this in our previous video. If I'm black, I go to the Bible because I'm looking for verses about black people. If I'm poor, I'm looking for verses that are going to encourage me in my poverty. I'm looking for verses about prosperity. If I'm rich, I'm looking for verses that will justify wealth. If I own slaves, I'm looking for verses that will justify slavery. And then I'll censor the verses that talk about liberating slaves. And we call this existentialism. It's I want the scripture to affirm me, it must agree with me. I'm basically imposing what I believe onto the scripture. It's I say Jesus, and it's not necessarily the right way of interpreting the scripture. The important thing for us when we interpret the Bible, allow the Bible to interpret itself, because a lot of people are now focusing: was Jesus black? Was Moses black? Was this person black, and so on. But the Bible's not trying to draw you to that. It's not trying to bring your attention to that. It's important for all of us to look in the scriptures and see ourselves in the scriptures. But when we see ourselves in the scriptures, we see ourselves in terms of behavior, in terms of morality. When we see Adam fall, that's me falling. When we see the temptation in the garden, man, this is the same way we get tempted. This is the same way that we choose to follow our hearts and our desires, and sometimes that brings us to the wrong place. It's a picture that points to the reality of our behavior, our morality, our values, and those sort of things. And I think that's where the Bible is trying to bring focus to, because at the moment in Israel, people are focusing so much on the prophecies that in the end times Israel, there's going to be wars and so on. A lot of people supporting the war in Israel. But I think that it's important when we interpret the scriptures to not always see it in one way, because you can read the Bible prophetically, but you can also read it historically. But you can also see in the scriptures that God has punished Israel whenever Israel's done the wrong thing. But at the moment, the people in Israel interpret the Bible to say God promised us this land, and therefore maybe we can do whatever we want. Not necessarily true, because God has allowed the Israelites in the past to go into captivity whenever they've disobeyed God. And God has done this, so beautifully, in that when Israel disobeyed God, He allowed the Babylonians, to conquer them. He allowed the Romans to conquer them. He allowed, as a way of bringing judgment. God has always allowed bad things to happen to His people. And so even the things that are committed now in the name of God in Israel, even if you interpret it prophetically to say it's end times, which can be true, but at the same time, God will still hold them accountable for their actions, because God has never called Israel, to not be a blessing to the world. God has always said to be a light to the nations, to be a blessing to the nations. But equally so, Hamas also sits there. They interpret their scriptures, to say the other person on the other side is an infidel. They're not the people of God. I'm the people of God. I'm entitled to the land. It's my God. It's my land. And so I must take it. I'm more important. And this is the danger or the ugly side of religion, when we interpret scriptures politically. And this is how Bishop Maponga actually wants us to interpret it, to always look for my side. God is supporting me. And this is what the Afrikaners also did when they came to South Africa. A lot of white people actually had that perception that they were the people of God. They were moving with God. God was behind them, and everyone else was heathen. And therefore, it didn't matter what we did with them. So this is why it's important for us not to interpret the Bible politically. And one of the worst things that have been done in the name of Christianity is when we've taken religion and politics and sort of brought it together. It actually has a very ugly side. And that is what Bishop Maponga is actually encouraging. So this is why there's a dangerous side for us to always be looking at scripture the way that we are. We mustn't look at scripture the way that we are, or the way that the angle in which we're looking at it, but we must interpret scripture the way that scripture is. We'll see you guys in the next video.